Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. Written by David Epstein. Summarized by Detailed Book Summaries. Don't forget to subscribe. Chapter 1. The Cult of the Head Start. Imagine you're watching two different childhoods unfold. In one, there's a boy whose father places a golf club into his tiny hands before he can even walk. By the age of 2, he's swinging with eerie precision. By 3, he's featured on national television. His training is meticulous, his focus singular, his path preordained. That boy becomes Tiger Woods. In the other story, there's a boy who spends his early years playing soccer, basketball, skateboarding, skiing, just about everything except the sport he'd eventually be known for. He picks up tennis later, casually, almost reluctantly, with no pressure from his parents. In fact, his mother, a tennis coach herself, deliberately avoids coaching him. That boy grows up to be Roger Federer. Now, let me ask you, which of these stories feels more like the one we've been told to admire? The one we've been encouraged to emulate? For most of us, it's Tiger. His rise fits neatly into our cultural obsession with the early start, the specialist, the laser-focused prodigy. We cling to this narrative because it's clean, comforting. It promises a kind of control. Start early, focus hard, master your craft. That's how you succeed. But what if that story, compelling as it is the exception, not the rule? What if this ideal of the child prodigy, the one-track expert, is not only misleading, but in many cases, actually harmful? This is where David Epstein begins his exploration, by challenging the cult of the head start. He introduces us to a world where early specialization is glorified almost religiously. In sports, in academics, in music, in parenting. Everywhere you turn, there's pressure to narrow down, to pick a lane and stay there. We're told the clock is ticking, that childhood is a race, and whoever gets the earliest jump will win. But here's the twist. Most of the world doesn't operate like a golf tournament. Life, as it turns out, is messy, unpredictable. It's full of ambiguity, shifting rules, and complex problems. And in that kind of world, Epstein argues, generalists, not specialists, have the edge. To make his case, he draws a critical distinction between two types of learning environments, kind and wicked. A kind learning environment is one like chess or golf, structured, repetitive, and rule-bound. In these domains, patterns repeat themselves. Feedback is immediate and clear. The earlier you start, the more practice you get, and the better you become. Tiger Woods thrived in a kind environment. His path makes perfect sense there. But most domains in life aren't kind. They're wicked. Wicked environments are unpredictable. The feedback is delayed or absent. The rules are unclear, constantly changing, or never fully defined. In these wicked environments, like entrepreneurship, creative writing, or medicine, simply logging more hours early on doesn't guarantee mastery. In fact, it can lock you into rigid patterns of thinking. What's needed instead is adaptability, flexibility, and broad experience. And that, Epstein says, is where generalists shine. So here's the deeper question Epstein asks us to consider. Are we preparing ourselves, and our children for the world we wish existed, or the one that actually does? In our rush to create specialists, are we producing people who are less equipped to handle complexity, uncertainty, and change? We live in a culture that pathologizes quitting. We call it flaky, aimless, weak. But Epstein turns that on its head. He introduces the concept of a sampling period, a phase of life when trying out different options, quitting and pivoting, are not signs of indecision, but essential for long-term growth. This is especially true in domains where success depends not on rote repetition, but on understanding nuance and applying knowledge creatively. Research backs this up. Studies of elite athletes show that most didn't specialize early. They played many sports, developed diverse motor skills, and chose their path later than you might expect. These athletes didn't burn out. They didn't break down. They flourished because they brought a well-rounded toolkit to their eventual specialty. The same pattern emerges in aviation. Fighter pilots who trained across multiple aircraft types, rather than mastering just one, developed a kind of transferable intuition. They weren't just learning how to fly. They were learning how to think in 3 dimensions, under pressure, across unfamiliar terrain. That breadth made them better in the long run. And here's the emotional heart of Epstein's message. If you didn't specialize early, if you bounced around, if you felt behind or unfocused, take a breath. You're not broken. You're building range. In fact, the most successful people in wicked environments, the kind that mirror real life, often have nonlinear paths. They've quit jobs, changed majors, started over. And instead of that being a weakness, it became their secret weapon. Each detour added a new layer of understanding, a new lens, a new way of thinking. It's tempting to idolize the master of one. But in a world that's increasingly complex, what we really need are masters of many, people who can cross disciplines, make unexpected connections, and bring fresh perspectives. Think of it like cooking. A specialist might be a world-class chef in one cuisine, say French, but a generalist, they've cooked Thai, Mexican, Indian, Japanese. They know how one ingredient from one tradition can transform a dish from another. Their range isn't a liability. It's their creativity engine. So what does this mean for us? For our careers, our families, our sense of purpose? First, it means we should delay specialization when possible. Let kids sample, explore, and even quit. Encourage curiosity, not just commitment. Second, we should reframe our own detours not as wasted time, but as vital training. Every sidestep, every career change, every new interest adds something to the mosaic of who we are. Third, we need to be wary of linear thinking. Success is rarely a straight line. Often, it's a winding path, and the people who thrive are the ones who stay flexible. Finally, and maybe most importantly, it means we should stop measuring ourselves against the Tiger Woods of the world. Because for every tiger, there are 100 Rogers, people who wandered, experimented, and arrived at greatness, not in spite of their meandering, but because of it. So as this chapter closes, the question is, how early did you start? It's how many places did you look before you chose? Did you allow yourself the freedom to explore? the space to learn broadly, the time to find not just a path, but the right path. In the cult of the head start, it's easy to feel late. But in the world Epstein paints, a world of complexity, creativity, and wicked problems, it's not the early bird who necessarily wins. It's the one who sees the whole field before making their move. That's the start of the journey into range. A journey not toward narrower focus, but toward broader understanding. And it begins by questioning everything we thought we knew about how success really works. Chapter 2. How the wicked world was made. Imagine for a moment that the world you live in is a board game. Now imagine there are two versions of this board game. In the first version, the rules are clear, the patterns repeat, and every time you make a move, you get feedback immediately, yes or no, right or wrong. You play the game enough times and you get better. The environment trains you. It's consistent, logical, and fair. That's a kind world. Think chess. The board is fixed. The pieces always move the same way, and mastery comes from practice and pattern recognition. Now flip the board. In the second version of the game, the rules are fuzzy. Sometimes they change. The feedback you get might be delayed, vague, or even deceptive. You might make a great move and still lose. You might take a terrible risk and win big. The same move that worked yesterday might fail tomorrow. This is the wicked world, a world full of uncertainty, where experience can be misleading and intuition can betray you. In Chapter 2, David Epstein walks us through this unsettling, complex territory. He wants us to stop assuming that the world works like chess, when more often than not, it operates like a chaotic puzzle with shifting pieces. This distinction between kind and wicked learning environments isn't just a clever metaphor. It's a way of understanding why generalists tend to succeed where narrow experts sometimes stumble. The idea begins with a psychologist named Robin Hogarth. Back in the 1970s, Hogarth noticed something troubling. People who were considered seasoned experts were making terrible predictions. These weren't amateurs. They were economists, doctors, intelligence analysts. They had data, credentials, and decades of experience, and yet their accuracy was barely better than chance. Why? Because their fields weren't giving them the kind of feedback that would actually make them better. See, in kind environments, feedback is reliable. You act, the world responds, you learn. The learning loop is tight and trustworthy. But in wicked environments, that loop breaks down. You might act, but the consequences are delayed or masked by noise. You can't always tell what caused what. And when feedback becomes unreliable, experience doesn't necessarily lead to expertise. Sometimes it leads to overconfidence. Take firefighters, for example. In traditional scenarios, they build pattern recognition, the ability to walk into a burning building and sense when something is off. This works when conditions are stable. But when the environment shifts, say, with new building materials or unexpected fire behavior, those same instincts can lead them straight into danger. What used to be wisdom becomes a trap. Their gut feelings no longer match the new reality. And that's the paradox. In a wicked world, experience doesn't always help you. Sometimes it hurts you because you think you know the pattern, You think you've seen this before, but you haven't. You're operating on outdated assumptions. You're trusting your brain to recognize something that no longer applies. This becomes even more dangerous when we carry the mindset of a kind world into a wicked one. That's where we start to see problems, real world, high-stakes problems. Think about medicine. We like to believe that diagnosing a patient is like solving a logic puzzle. You get the symptoms, plug them into your mental model, and out pops a diagnosis. But medicine is wicked. Symptoms overlap. New diseases appear. Treatments interact in unpredictable ways. A doctor who relies solely on pattern recognition can miss something important. Worse, they may feel more confident about their wrong decision because they've seen something like this before. The issue isn't with specialization itself. It's with over-applying the rules of one environment to another. Kind environments reward specialists, but wicked environments reward adaptability. They reward the ability to step back, rethink, and draw from diverse experiences. That's why generalists, people who have sampled different paths, crossed disciplines, seen the world through multiple lenses, often perform better when things get messy. Epstein illustrates this beautifully by contrasting chess with firefighting. In chess, the board has 64 squares, and nothing changes. The same strategies that worked a century ago still work today. Chess masters are walking databases of patterns. Their strength is their ability to match a new position to one they've memorized. The world of chess is ruthlessly kind. Train long enough, and the game reveals itself to you. But firefighting, or emergency medicine, or climate science, or business strategy, these are not games of repetition. They're filled with unknown variables. One moment, everything seems normal. The next, the rules have shifted. In those moments, the firefighter who's seen only one type of blaze is less useful than the one who's fought many types of fires in many types of buildings under different conditions. The one with breadth is less likely to be fooled by the familiar. And here, where the emotional insight kicks in, most of us, in our careers and lives, operate in wicked environments. We change jobs, industries evolve, technologies disrupt our routines. There's no universal playbook. The idea that we should commit to one thing early and never deviate, that's a relic from a kind world. But we've dragged that relic into a world that changes too fast for it to make sense. Think about your own life. Have you ever made a decision based on experience, only to have it completely backfire? Have you ever watched someone with years of knowledge make a call that turned out to be disastrously wrong? That's the wickedness at work. It's not that these people were incompetent. It's that their environment had changed and they didn't adjust. Their experience, instead of helping them, locked them into a faulty pattern. That's why Epstein insists we need range. Range isn't just about having a wide skill set. It's about having perspective. The ability to step outside your field, to borrow ideas from elsewhere, to question your assumptions before charging ahead. It's about resisting the urge to lock into one framework and call it truth. In wicked environments, truth is a moving target. Range gives you the flexibility to follow it. And here's the deeper philosophical question lurking in this chapter. How do we build judgment in a world that doesn't give us clear answers? How do we become wise, not just smart? The answer, Epstein suggests, lies not in drilling deeper, but in roaming wider, in exposing ourselves to uncertainty, in building a tolerance for complexity, in saying, I don't know, and meaning it before we leap into action. So what does this mean for how we live and learn? For starters, it means we should be cautious about overvaluing credentials and experience when they come from narrow environments. We should ask not just how long someone has done something, but how many contexts they've seen it in. We should train people not just to execute, but to question, not just to repeat, but to rethink. And we should give ourselves permission to be learners, not just performers, to admit when we don't understand, to explore without a map. Because in a wicked world, the person who insists they have the answer is often the one who's least prepared for what comes next. The irony is that the world is growing more wicked, not less. Technology changes faster. Problems grow more complex. Information floods our lives, but wisdom feels scarcer than ever. If we keep applying the strategies of a kind world, early specialization, narrow training, overconfidence in simple answers, we'll be solving yesterday's problems while today's realities leave us behind. But if we cultivate range, if we learn to think broadly, connect creatively, and adapt quickly, we'll not only survive in the wicked world, we'll thrive in it. Chapter 3. When less of the same is more, close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A dark room, a blip of light bouncing across a screen. In this dimly lit laboratory, somewhere in the 1940s, a group of psychologists is watching a pigeon peck at a disc. The bird is learning, slowly but surely, to associate its behavior with a reward. Peck, pellet, peck, pellet. Over time, the pigeon starts to internalize the connection. Cause and effect. Do this, get that. In a sense, it's learning like a little machine. Now shift that image. Picture a child in a kindergarten classroom, not just absorbing information, but playing with it, making up games, asking weird questions, using building blocks to design a spaceship that probably can't fly, but just might, if only in their imagination. That child isn't just learning rules, they're testing them, bending them, sometimes breaking them altogether. They're not a pigeon, they're a thinker. This, in essence, is the world David Epstein invites us into in Chapter 3. A world where not all learning is created equal, where the way we teach, train, and measure intelligence can often backfire, especially when we assume that more of the same kind of training will always lead to better results. Sometimes, paradoxically, less is more. This chapter is a fascinating deep dive into what happens when we try to build expertise by piling on repetition, especially in wicked domains. Epstein brings us into the heart of educational psychology, where decades of research have shown that rote repetition, the same kind of practice, over and over, can produce impressive short-term gains, but often fails when the context changes. In other words, you might get good at a test, but not at the real world. He introduces us to the concept of transfer of learning. That's the ability to take knowledge from one situation and apply it in another. And here's the problem. Most traditional forms of education, especially those focused on drilling narrow skills, are terrible at promoting transfer. You can get someone really good at solving a particular type of math problem or recognizing a pattern in a medical image. But when the problem looks even slightly different or lands in a different domain, they're lost. To make this point concrete, Epstein walks us through a classic study in radiology. Experienced doctors were shown images of chest X-rays and asked to spot subtle anomalies. When the X-rays were typical, they performed well. But when the format changed, even slightly, their performance collapsed. They hadn't developed deep understanding. They had trained themselves to recognize patterns only in the format they'd seen before. Now pause and think about that. These were not beginners. They were experts, but their expertise was brittle, narrow, context-bound. It didn't transfer. That's the danger of overspecialization. It can produce fragile competence. You become a master in one context, but when the ground shifts, and it always does, you're stuck. Or worse, you're confidently wrong. Epstein contrasts this with another kind of learning, what cognitive scientists call desirable difficulties. These are learning experiences that feel harder, but actually produce deeper, more durable understanding. For example, spacing out practice sessions instead of cramming, mixing up different types of problems instead of repeating the same one, testing yourself without cues. All of these feel slower, messier, and less efficient in the short term. But in the long term, they build flexibility. They prepare you not just to solve this problem, but to recognize and approach different ones. Think of it like lifting weights. If you do the same exact motion every day, same weight, same rep, same speed, you might get stronger at that specific movement, but you won't get well-rounded strength. You'll plateau. You might even get injured. Real strength comes from variety, from imbalance, from challenge. Your brain works the same way. This chapter also gives us a powerful analogy from music. Epstein describes a study where students were taught to play a song either by repeating one small section until they mastered it, or by practicing the entire song, even though they made more mistakes in the moment. Guess which group performed better later? Not the one that felt smoother in practice. It was the group that wrestled with the whole song, the group that made more mistakes along the way. Why? Because they learned to navigate complexity. They learned structure, not just surface patterns. They developed range within the domain, not robotic fluency. And here, where the emotional punch comes in, we live in a world that often rewards the illusion of mastery. Fast results, high test scores, clean, confident answers. But real understanding, real wisdom is messy. It's slow. It involves failure, revision, doubt. If we keep training people to optimize for speed and certainty, we're not just limiting them. We're setting them up for fragility. Epstein encourages us to embrace the discomfort of harder learning. He suggests that our obsession with efficiency, with instant feedback and tight focus, might be doing more harm than good. Sometimes, the most effective learners are the ones who seem slowest. They're not just memorizing, they're constructing meaning. They're building mental models that will hold up when the problem changes. And that brings us to a key insight. Breadth within learning isn't just about knowing a lot of things. It's about knowing how things connect. It's about recognizing when a familiar problem is actually new. And that only happens when you've struggled, when you've had to figure things out without a script. So, what does all this mean for the rest of us? It means we should rethink how we learn, how we teach, how we assess progress. It means we should stop measuring success by how quickly someone gets it and start looking at how well they retain and apply that knowledge down the line. It means making room for practice that feels inefficient, for teaching that feels slower, for learning environments that are frustrating by design because they're building strength that lasts. It also means we should be kind to ourselves when we feel behind, when we struggle to grasp something right away, when others seem to be racing ahead. It's easy to feel like we're not keeping up. But if we're engaging deeply, if we're connecting dots, if we're learning broadly and slowly, we might be building something far more powerful, something that won't collapse when the format changes. Because life doesn't give us the same test over and over. It throws us new ones, unexpected, wicked ones. And when that happens, the person who learned only by repetition may be stuck. But the person who learned through struggle, through flexibility, through discomfort, they're ready. So the next time you're learning something new and it feels frustrating or slow, remember, that may be a sign that it's working. That may be the moment your brain is doing the hard, worthwhile work of becoming more than a pigeon in a lab. It's becoming a mind that can flex, pivot, and thrive, especially when less of the same is more. Chapter 4, Learning, Fast and Slow. Imagine standing on a stage. The lights are hot. A question flashes across the screen. You hit your buzzer. Fast, confidence. The crowd gasps, you got it right. The host smiles. You're clearly sharp, smart, quick on the draw. And let's be honest, it feels good. We admire fast learners, the quick thinkers, the people who always seem to have the right answer before the rest of us have even processed the question. In school, they were the kids with their hands up before the teacher finished speaking. In meetings, they chime in effortlessly. In interviews, they sound polished, composed, and clever. But here's the question David Epstein asks in Chapter 4. Does being fast mean you're actually learning better? Or just that you're good at sounding like you are? This chapter is all about the illusion of rapid learning and the surprising truth that slow, effortful learning might not just be more valuable, but necessary for deep understanding. And to explain this, Epstein takes us into the minds of two thinkers whose ideas you might already know, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Kahneman and Tversky, the godfathers of behavioral economics, were fascinated by the quirks and flaws in human thinking. They coined the famous terms System 1 and System 2, two modes of thought that govern how we reason, decide, and learn. System 1 is fast, intuitive, automatic. It's the gut reaction, the flash of insight. System 2 is slow, deliberate, effortful. It's the part that checks the math, questions assumptions, and grinds through complexity. Most of us, most of the time, prefer System 1. It feels good, it's easy, and in many situations, it's incredibly useful, especially in kind environments where patterns repeat and feedback is reliable. But in wicked environments, System 1 can trick us. It leaps to conclusions. It relies on shallow analogies. It's confident when it should be cautious. Epstein uses this framework to explain something many of us have felt, but rarely articulate. Learning that feels fast is often shallow. We mistake fluency for understanding. We assume that if we can recall something quickly or explain it smoothly, we've mastered it. But true mastery, deep, flexible, transferable knowledge comes from struggle, from system 2. To illustrate this, Epstein introduces the story of the U.S. Air Force Academy. Every year, thousands of cadets take core math classes. Researchers followed them over time, trying to understand which instructors produced the best outcomes. And the findings were surprising, maybe even unsettling. Instructors who got the best student evaluations, the ones students liked the most, were often the ones whose students performed worse in future, more advanced classes. Why? Because those instructors optimized for short-term success. They taught to the test. They made the material feel easier. And their students, though they performed well in the moment, hadn't built the deep understanding they'd need later. In contrast, instructors whose students struggled more, who received lower evaluations, had students who ultimately did better. These teachers weren't failing. They were forcing system 2 thinking. They made students wrestle with concepts, made them figure things out. The process felt slower, harder, but it stuck. Now pause and let that sink in, because it has huge implications, not just for education, but for how we train, work, and live. We are wired to seek fluency, to favor what's easy and fast. But sometimes, the most powerful learning is hidden in the hard, messy, uncomfortable stuff. The kind that makes you feel like you're failing, when really you're growing. This is what Epstein calls the difference between performance and learning. Performance is how well you can do something now. Learning is how well you'll retain it and use it later. But performance and learning often move in opposite directions. If you optimize for performance in the moment, you might be undermining your long-term growth. Think of it like a gym. You can walk in, do a quick routine that feels good, that looks impressive, that gives you a short-term pump. Or you can do something hard, something you're not good at yet, something that forces your muscles to adapt. The first makes you feel strong now. The second actually makes you stronger. This idea applies not just to academics or physical training, but to careers, creativity, leadership, anything where complexity rules. If you only ever take on tasks you already know how to do, you'll look competent, but you won't grow. If you seek out challenges that force you to slow down, rethink, ask for help, that's where transformation happens. Epstein isn't saying we should never rely on System 1. It's essential in many parts of life, but he's warning us, don't confuse speed with depth. Don't confuse confidence with competence. If something comes easily, question it. And if something feels hard, don't run from it. That might be a sign that real learning is underway. This brings us back to one of the core themes of range, the importance of struggle in building adaptable, broad, deep thinking minds. Struggle is not just a nuisance or a hurdle. It's a teacher. And when we remove struggle from the learning process, by simplifying too much, by spoon-feeding answers, by over-specializing, we're not helping. We're robbing ourselves of the very thing that produces long-term success. Here, where it gets even more personal, Epstein reminds us that many of the most impactful thinkers, creators, and innovators in history weren't the fastest or the most efficient. They were the ones who took the time to dig deep, who weren't afraid to go slow, who questioned easy answers and wrestled with complexity. They built mental models that lasted because they didn't rush. So what does this mean for you right now? It means that when you're learning something new and it feels hard or slow or confusing, don't panic. Don't give up. That feeling isn't a sign that you're failing. It might be the clearest evidence that you're actually learning, that your brain is working harder than usual and laying down stronger foundations. It also means we should be careful how we evaluate success in ourselves and others. Sometimes the person who looks like a genius today may crumble tomorrow. And sometimes the quiet struggler, the one who's working through things carefully, methodically, patiently, that person might be building something that lasts. In the end, learning fast may win applause, but learning slow might just win the future. Chapter 5. Thinking outside experience. Have you ever stared at a problem so long that it starts to blur, like staring at a single puzzle piece without being able to see the whole picture? Now, imagine stepping back, walking into another room, forgetting about the puzzle entirely for a while. And then suddenly, bam, it hits you. Not because you figured it out by focusing harder, because you let go and let something else slip in. That right there is the theme of Chapter 5. Sometimes the best solutions don't come from deeper focus, but from stepping outside the box completely, thinking beyond your experience, dipping into a domain you don't specialize in, getting out of the weeds to see the whole forest. This chapter takes us deep into the strange and counterintuitive power of distance. Not just physical distance, but mental distance from a problem, a domain, a routine. And it begins with a fascinating look at how some of the most powerful innovations in science and technology didn't come from experts in the field, but from outsiders. David Epstein opens with a compelling story, a crowdsourced innovation platform called InnoCentive, where companies and research labs post problems they can't solve and then invite anyone in the world to try. These aren't trivial problems. We're talking about everything from cancer treatments to chemical synthesis. But here's the kicker. Outsiders solve the problems more often than insiders. Why? Because insiders are often too close, too tied to existing assumptions, too fluent in the standard models. They know the rules so well that they can't imagine breaking them. Outsiders, on the other hand, come in from a distance. They may not have all the insider knowledge, but they also don't have the same blind spots. They look at the problem with fresh eyes. They borrow tools from other fields. They make weird, cross-disciplinary connections that insiders might dismiss as irrelevant or naive. And yet, those weird connections often turn out to be breakthroughs. It's a radical idea when you stop and think about it. Ignorance, in just the right amount, can be an advantage. Not deep, total ignorance, but just enough distance to remain unshackled from the correct way of thinking. Now, let's bring this home. How often do we judge ourselves or others by how much experience they have in a field? Years on the job, credentials, specialization. We assume that the deeper someone is in a domain, the more qualified they are to solve its problems. But Epstein challenges that. He tells us the farther someone is from a problem's traditional domain, the more likely they are to solve it in a novel way, especially when traditional methods fail. He introduces research by Karim Lakhani and others who found that outsiders were more likely to submit winning solutions on a no-centive when their background was marginally related, but not identical to the field of the problem. This concept is sometimes called the adjacent possible. You're not clueless, but you're not locked in either. You're standing close enough to see, far enough to imagine. Epstein takes us next to the world of design with the example of IDEO, the renowned global design firm. IDEO intentionally builds project teams with wildly diverse backgrounds: biologists, artists, anthropologists, engineers. Why? Because they know that real innovation doesn't come from everyone speaking the same language. It comes from translation, from collision, from people seeing problems through lenses the experts forgot existed. This brings us to one of the most beautiful insights of this chapter. If you want to think differently, you often need to think like a different person. Think about your own life. Have you ever had a breakthrough not by digging deeper, but by talking to someone who had nothing to do with your problem? Maybe a partner, a friend, someone in a totally different field. They asked a dumb question or made a random observation, and it cracked something open for you. That's the value of cross-pollination, of stepping outside your domain, of asking questions that seem irrelevant until they're not. And this is more than just anecdote. Epstein shares a fascinating study of scientists publishing influential papers. The ones who had the broadest citation habits, the ones who read and referenced work outside their own field, were the most likely to make a major impact. In other words, big breakthroughs come from wide reading, not narrow drilling. You can think of it like mixing colors. If all you ever work with is blue, you might get really good at making new shades of blue. But mix in yellow or red, or even just a little white, and suddenly your palette explodes. New combinations, new textures, new ways of seeing the canvas. So what's the practical lesson here? It's not that experience doesn't matter, it does. But experience alone is not enough. If we want to grow, to innovate, to solve wicked problems, we need to intentionally invite the outsider's perspective. We need to move sideways, to read widely, to borrow tools from unexpected places, to ask not just what do I know, but what don't I know that might help me see this differently. And even more importantly, we need to stop being so afraid of not being an expert. Sometimes, the very thing we think disqualifies us, our distance, our inexperience, is exactly what makes us valuable. Epstein gives us a gentle but powerful challenge here. Embrace your outsider status. Whether you're switching careers, picking up a new skill, or tackling a tough problem, don't be discouraged if you don't have the background. Instead, lean into the fact that you might ask questions others are too close to ask, that your ignorance might spark clarity they've missed. Let's say it plainly. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem isn't to go deeper, it's to go sideways, to shift your perspective, to look at it with new eyes, from a new angle, through a new metaphor. And that's what the best generalists do. They roam, they borrow, they see patterns that others overlook, not because they know more, but because they know differently. So here's your takeaway from Chapter 5. If you're feeling like an outsider good, stay curious. Ask weird questions. Mix disciplines. Seek analogy. Talk to people outside your field. Read things that seem unrelated. Learn things just for the joy of it. Because you never know which piece, pulled from the far edge of your experience, might become the missing key to your next breakthrough. Chapter 6. The trouble with too much grit. You've probably heard it before. Maybe from a coach, a teacher, a commencement speaker with a booming voice and a firm handshake. Never quit. Stick with it. Push through. Grind. Outlast. Be the last one standing. And if you're like most people, you've internalized this message. You've probably felt guilty for quitting something, even when it felt deeply wrong for you. There's a moral halo around grit. It's the stuff of legends, of Rocky montages and late-night study sessions. It's how we think winners are made. But in Chapter 6, David Epstein leans in with a provocative whisper. What if that's not always true? What if sticking it out is sometimes the worst thing you can do? Let that land for a second, because this chapter asks a question few people dare to. Can grit become a trap? To answer it, Epstein brings us into the world of military academies, where grit is studied like a sacred artifact. He walks us through the famous research by psychologist Angela Duckworth, whose grit scale has become a cultural touchstone. Her work found that cadets who scored higher on measures of grit, passion, and perseverance were more likely to make it through brutal initiation phases, like beast barracks. But then Epstein adds a wrinkle. He asks, what happens after that? After the hazing? After the test? It turns out, grit helps you survive in the short term. It's great for specific, well-defined, high-pressure challenges with clear rules. But in the long term, in open-ended, unpredictable environments, like real life, grit isn't always the hero. Sometimes, what you need most isn't to push harder, it's to walk away. He introduces us to the concept of match quality. It's the idea that the better the fit between who you are, your interests, abilities, and values, and what you're doing, the more likely you are to succeed and feel fulfilled. And here's the kicker. The only way to find high match quality is by trying different things, quitting some, pivoting, exploring. So yes, grit matters, but only after you've found the right match. Grit applied in the wrong place, just grinding away at something that doesn't suit you, is not courage. It's inertia, or fear of change dressed up as virtue. Epstein takes us deeper with the story of Frances Hesselbein, who didn't start her career in leadership, management, or any executive track. She was a Girl Scout troop leader, but through a series of shifts, saying yes to unexpected roles, stepping away when it felt right, she eventually became the CEO of the National Girl Scouts and a major influence on leadership theory. Frances did stick with it. She adapted. She followed fit over fear. And that made all the difference. This chapter also revisits the sampling period idea introduced earlier in the book. In career terms, it's the phase where people explore different options before committing deeply. Epstein points out that successful people often had longer sampling periods. They were slower to specialize. They didn't just double down early and hope for the best. They wandered, adjusted, changed course. Think of it like dating before marriage, or trying a bunch of different instruments before choosing one to master. The time spent sampling isn't wasted, it's essential. It gives you data about who you are, what excites you, what drains you. Grit without that data, it's blind commitment. And yet, culturally, we tend to shame quitting. We use words like flaky, indecisive, lazy. We celebrate the marathoner, not the person who pulls off the track and says, "This isn't my race." But Epstein says we need to change that narrative, because strategic quitting isn't weakness, it's wisdom. This part of the chapter is deeply personal. He tells stories of people who left impressive careers, lawyers, doctors, executives, not because they weren't capable, but because they realized this isn't it. And once they left, they found something that lit them up, something they could commit to fully, not out of obligation, but because it fit. So here's the heart of chapter 6. Grit is powerful, but only in the right context. The trick isn't to be gritty no matter what. It's to know when to be gritty and when to pivot, when to lean in and when to let go. That's not weakness. That's range. Ask yourself, are you sticking with something just because it's familiar, because you're afraid of being seen as a quitter? Or are you in it because it genuinely aligns with who you are and what you want? And if you're afraid to leave, Epstein offers a gut check question. If someone offered you the same opportunity today, knowing what you know now, would you take it? If the answer is no, why are you still there? Here's the powerful reframe: quit like a scientist. A scientist runs experiments. They form hypotheses. They test. If the results don't align, they change the approach. They don't grit their teeth and run the same experiment forever, hoping something changes. They adapt. They adjust. You can do the same. In your work, your relationships, your creative pursuits. You can try, reflect, and let go when it no longer fits. And so, chapter 6 doesn't dismantle grit. It puts it in its proper place. Grit is the fuel for deep commitment, but the destination still matters. So go ahead, be persistent, be tough, be scrappy, but only after you've asked the deeper question: is this worth persisting in? Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't hanging on, it's walking away to find something that actually deserves your grit. Chapter 7, FLIRTING, with your possible selves. Close your eyes for a second and picture this: a long hallway with doors lining each side. Behind each door is a different you. One's a teacher, another's a writer. There's one that's a traveler, another a chef, one that runs a nonprofit, and maybe one who never left your hometown. Some are bold, some quiet, some are wildly adventurous, some cautious and steady. All of them are possible versions of you, your possible selves. Now, ask yourself, which doors have you opened? Which ones did you walk away from too soon? Which are still waiting for you to try the handle? This chapter is about those selves, the unlived lives, the roads not yet taken, the experimental identities we flirt with and sometimes abandon too soon. And it's also about why that flirting, that exploration, isn't a distraction. It's the very thing that shapes a more authentic life. Epstein introduces us to this idea through research from psychologist Hazel Marcus, who coined the term possible selves. The concept is simple but profound. We each carry within us a range of identities we might become, want to become, or fear becoming. These selves shape our behavior. They give us direction. And most importantly, they're fluid. They change, they evolve, they multiply as we move through life. But here's the cultural tension. We often treat career paths or life paths as if they're linear commitments. Choose early, commit hard, don't stray, don't doubt. If you change too much, you look indecisive. If you explore too late, you're behind. And yet, when you talk to people who found deep fulfillment in their work or calling, they tell you something different. They tried a lot of things first. They changed. They meandered. They failed at one door before walking through another. One powerful story Epstein shares is that of Frances Hesselbein from earlier chapters. But here, he also brings in a range of voices: athletes, artists, executives, and researchers, all of whom bounced between interests before landing somewhere meaningful. This brings us to one of the most compelling insights of the chapter. You don't find yourself by deciding who you are, you find yourself by testing who you might become. Let that settle in. You don't discover your best life by picking one possible self at 18 and holding on for dear life. You discover it by experimenting, by flirting, by playing out small, low-risk versions of different lives, trying a class, volunteering somewhere new, picking up a hobby, switching roles, moving cities, writing that blog, starting that side project, testing the fit. This is what psychologists call active self-construction. And it's crucial, because if you never experiment, you don't just miss out on a better path, you lose the chance to gather the data you need to even know what might fit. It's a bit like dating your future selves. You try one out. Spend time with it. See how it feels. Is it fulfilling? Do you come alive in that space? Or do you shrink, feel off? The goal isn't to marry the first one you meet. It's to learn what lights you up. One of the most touching stories in this chapter is about an individual who worked in high finance for years, was praised for their grit and long hours, but inside felt dead. After a career break and a stint in social work, they realized, this is who I was always meant to be. They had flirted with that self years earlier, volunteering at a youth center in college, but brushed it off as impractical. Now, years later, they finally opened that door for real. This isn't a one-off story. Epstein reminds us that most people don't end up in careers that match their college major. And many of the most impactful people we admire today started out doing something totally different. What they had in common: they didn't stop exploring. The idea that you must choose your one true self early and stick with it is not only limiting, it's harmful. It locks people into lives that don't fit. It turns curiosity into guilt. And it discourages one of the most important kinds of learning there is: learning who you are by trying on different ways of being. So, what should we do instead? We need to cultivate what Epstein calls a test and learn mindset toward identity. Not plan and commit, but try and reflect. Like a scientist, again, but this time with yourself as the experiment. Here's a practical way to do it. Instead of asking, "What do I want to be?" try asking, "What's something I'm curious about then? What's a low-stakes way I can explore that?" And finally, what did I learn about myself in the process? That might mean taking a class in something completely unrelated to your job, shadowing someone, starting a side hustle, moving into a different team, or just reading widely outside your domain. You don't have to blow up your life. You just have to stay in motion. Keep testing doors. This isn't just for young people. Epstein is clear. It's never too late. Some people discover their best self at 40, others at 60. The key is not when you start exploring, but that you keep exploring, that you refuse to lock yourself into a single identity too soon or for too long. So, if you're feeling stuck, here's the gentle invitation this chapter offers. Give yourself permission to flirt again with a new interest, a new role, a different version of yourself, even if it's small, even if it doesn't make sense on paper. Because the real tragedy isn't trying and failing, it's never trying and never knowing. And if you're worried what other people will think, remember this: everyone's just trying to figure it out. The people who seem most confident in their path are often just the ones who have tested the most doors. And the more doors you try, the more you learn not just about what's out there, but about who you are becoming. So here's your takeaway from Chapter 7. You're not a fixed point. You're a moving constellation of possible selves. Don't freeze that motion too early. Stay curious. Keep testing. Keep learning. Because each version of you, each flirtation, is a clue. And eventually, those clues add up to a life that's not just impressive, but deeply you. Chapter 8, The Outsider Advantage. Have you ever been the newcomer in a room? Maybe at a new job, a new field, a different country, or an unexpected role. You probably felt like you didn't belong, like everyone else had some invisible rule book you weren't handed. But what if that discomfort was actually your superpower? That's the heart of this chapter. You see, we're taught that deep, narrow expertise wins, that the person with the most time in a field, the longest resume, the thickest stack of credentials, is the one who's most likely to solve big problems. And sure, in some domains, especially the kind David Epstein calls kind environments, where rules are clear and repetition leads to mastery, that's often true. But what about messy, complex, unpredictable environments? The kind where problems are fuzzy, patterns aren't obvious, and the rules change on you mid-game. That's where something surprising happens. The outsider often beats the expert. Epstein opens this chapter with a case study from the world of scientific innovation. The website InnoCentive, a platform where companies post scientific problems they can't solve, and outsiders from completely unrelated fields take a crack at them. Now, you'd expect that the people with the most domain-specific experience would be the best at solving these problems. But InnoCentive found something else. The most successful solvers were often far outside the problem's original domain. A physicist might solve a chemistry problem. A mechanical engineer might crack a biomedical challenge. Why? because those outsiders brought fresh perspectives. They didn't suffer from cognitive entrenchment, a kind of mental rigidity that happens when you know too much and start seeing problems only one way. They weren't bound by the way it's always been done. They looked at things with open, untrained eyes. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed. This isn't just theory. Epstein backs it up with research on innovation and problem solving across disciplines. The F in Dings are consistent. Diversity of thought, especially from people outside a domain, leads to more creative, more effective solutions. And it's not just in science. He introduces us to Gunpei Yokoi, the brilliant but self-taught Nintendo engineer who revolutionized the gaming world not by pushing the limits of cutting-edge tech, but by repurposing outdated tech in clever new ways. He called it lateral thinking with withered technology. Yok wasn't at the bleeding edge of electronics. He didn't invent the most powerful graphics or processors. Instead, he tinkered. He combined simple components in playful ways that others more qualified engineers overlooked. The result? The Game Boy. A device built with older parts that was cheaper, more durable, and more fun than its competitors. It sold over 100 million units. Yokoi's lack of elite technical depth in any one area wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It freed him to think differently, to look at technology as a toy, not as a contest of specs. His outsider status gave him range. Epstein then zooms out. This is the power of interdisciplinary thinking. People who span domains, who bring insights from one area into another, often outperform those who stay within their narrow specialty. Because innovation happens at the intersections. He tells us about Frederick Brooks, the computer scientist who insisted his students study the humanities, not just engineering. Why? Because when software engineers are also philosophers, designers, or musicians, they see human problems differently. They code for people, not just for efficiency. This might feel counterintuitive. In a world obsessed with optimization, the fastest path, the straightest line, it's tempting to believe that more focus, more depth, more specialization is always the answer. But Epstein reminds us, in complex systems, depth alone won't save you. Range will. And often, outsiders ask the questions insiders forgot to ask. They don't assume. They don't skip steps. They bring in metaphors from other worlds. And sometimes, those metaphors unlock entirely new ways of seeing. Take this personally for a second. Have you ever stopped yourself from contributing because you felt underqualified? Have you ever thought, I'm not an expert, I don't have the right to offer an opinion here? This chapter asks you to flip that script. Your outsider perspective might be the very thing that breaks the groupthink. Your questions might surface the blind spots. Your experience in an unrelated field might be exactly the ingredient that's missing. Here, the key takeaway. Don't wait to be qualified in the traditional sense. Contribute, experiment, cross-pollinate. Because the world's biggest breakthroughs often come not from deep insiders, but from courageous outsiders willing to see the problem differently. And this doesn't mean expertise is bad. Epstein isn't anti-expert. He's pro-cross-contextual thinking. He's challenging the idea that only one kind of mind should be in the room. In fact, the best teams aren't made of identical experts. They're made of complementary perspectives, people who think differently, ask weird questions, and see what others can't. So if you're an outsider, own it. If you're a generalist in a world of specialists, lean in. You may not know the rule book, but maybe that's the point. Because sometimes, to change the game, you have to come in not knowing how it's played. Chapter 8, The Outsider Advantage. Have you ever been the newcomer in a room? Maybe at a new job, a new field, a different country, or an unexpected role. You probably felt like you didn't belong, like everyone else had some invisible rule book you weren't handed. But what if that discomfort was actually your superpower? That's the heart of this chapter. You see, we're taught that deep, narrow expertise wins, that the person with the most time in a field, the longest resume, the thickest stack of credentials, is the one who's most likely to solve big problems. And sure, in some domains, especially the kind David Epstein calls kind environments, where rules are clear and repetition leads to mastery, that's often true. But what about messy, complex, unpredictable environments? The kind where problems are fuzzy, patterns aren't obvious, and the rules change on you mid-game. That's where something surprising happens. The outsider often beats the expert. Epstein opens this chapter with a case study from the world of scientific innovation. The website InnoCentive, a platform where companies post scientific problems they can't solve, and outsiders from completely unrelated fields take a crack at them. Now, you'd expect that the people with the most domain-specific experience would be the best at solving these problems. But InnoCentive found something else. The most successful solvers were often far outside the problem's original domain. A physicist might solve a chemistry problem. A mechanical engineer might crack a biomedical challenge. Why? Because those outsiders brought fresh perspectives. They didn't suffer from cognitive entrenchment, a kind of mental rigidity that happens when you know too much and start seeing problems only one way. They weren't bound by the way it's always been done. They looked at things with open, untrained eyes. And sometimes that's exactly what's needed. This isn't just theory. Epstein backs it up with research on innovation and problem solving across disciplines. The findings are consistent. Diversity of thought, especially from people outside a domain, leads to more creative, more effective solutions. And it's not just in science. He introduces us to Gunpei Yokoi, the brilliant but self-taught Nintendo engineer who revolutionized the gaming world not by pushing the limits of cutting-edge tech, but by repurposing outdated tech in clever new ways. He called it lateral thinking with withered technology. Yokoi wasn't at the bleeding edge of electronics. He didn't invent the most powerful graphics or processors. Instead, he tinkered. He combined simple components in playful ways that others, more qualified engineers overlooked. The result, the Game Boy. A device built with older parts that was cheaper, more durable, and more fun than its competitors. It sold over 100 million units. Yokoi's lack of elite technical depth in any one area wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. It freed him to think differently, to look at technology as a toy not as a contest of specs. His outsider status gave him range. Epstein then zooms out. This is the power of interdisciplinary thinking. People who span domains, who bring insights from one area into another, often outperform those who stay within their narrow specialty. Because innovation happens at the intersections. He tells us about Frederick Brooks, the computer scientist who insisted his students study the humanities, not just engineering. Why? Because when software engineers are also philosophers, designers, or musicians, they see human problems differently. They code for people, not just for efficiency. This might feel counterintuitive. In a world obsessed with optimization, the fastest path, the straightest line, it's tempting to believe that more focus, more depth, more specialization is always the answer. But Epstein reminds us, in complex systems, depth alone won't save you. Range will. And often, outsiders ask the questions insiders forgot to ask. They don't assume. They don't skip steps. They bring in metaphors from other worlds. And sometimes, those metaphors unlock entirely new ways of seeing. Take this personally for a second. Have you ever stopped yourself from contributing because you felt underqualified? Have you ever thought, I'm not an expert, I don't have the right to offer an opinion here? This chapter asks you to flip that script. Your outsider perspective might be the very thing that breaks the groupthink. Your questions might surface the blind spots. Your experience in an unrelated field might be exactly the ingredient that's missing. Here, the key takeaway. Don't wait to be qualified in the traditional sense. Contribute, experiment, cross-pollinate. Because the world's biggest breakthroughs often come not from deep insiders, but from courageous outsiders willing to see the problem differently. And this doesn't mean expertise is bad. Epstein isn't anti-expert. He's pro-cross-contextual thinking. He's challenging the idea that only one kind of mind should be in the room. In fact, the best teams aren't made of identical experts. They're made of complementary perspectives, people who think differently, ask weird questions, and see what others can't. So if you're an outsider, own it. If you're a generalist in a world of specialists, lean in. You may not know the rule book, but maybe that's the point. Because sometimes, to change the game, you have to come in not knowing how it's played. Chapter 9. Lateral Thinking with Withered Technology. Let's start with a story. It's the 1980s. Video game companies are fighting a brutal tech war. Everyone's trying to cram more power into smaller consoles, better graphics, faster processing. They're focused on the next big thing. Enter Nintendo. But instead of joining the tech arms race, Nintendo takes a hard left turn. Their engineers don't chase cutting-edge processors or state-of-the-art screens. They do something wildly counterintuitive. They use old parts, the kind no one else wants anymore. Cheap, simple, outdated, and yet they win. Why? Because Nintendo wasn't trying to impress with specs. They were trying to create fun. And fun doesn't need bleeding-edge technology. It needs cleverness, surprise, design that delights. This approach became known as lateral thinking with withered technology, a phrase coined by Gunpei Yokoi, the genius behind the Game Boy. He wasn't an elite engineer. He didn't graduate top of his class in hardware design. What he did have was range. He came from a background that mixed toy making with electronics. He brought a playfulness into his engineering that others didn't. And that's the key to lateral thinking. It means solving problems not by digging deeper, but by stepping sideways, by looking at them from a different angle entirely. This chapter is full of stories and studies that show how creativity often comes from recombination, not invention. Epstein takes us into the minds of people who mash up unrelated ideas and make something entirely new. Think artists who borrow from science, engineers who play music, or business people who study improv. One powerful example comes from the design of the Polaroid camera. Edwin Land, its inventor, didn't create the camera from scratch. He was inspired when his young daughter asked why she couldn't see a photo immediately after it was taken. That child's curiosity sparked a series of experiments, and ultimately, a device that combined chemistry, optics, and mechanical engineering in a totally new way. Again, not invention, recombination. And that's what lateral thinking does. It asks, what if we connect this to that? It thrives on analogies. It loves metaphors. It plays with constraints instead of running from them. And it doesn't care if the tools are shiny and new. Sometimes, the best tool is the one everyone else has forgotten. This flies in the face of what most of us are taught. In school, in business, in tech, we're often told that the newest thing is the most valuable. That to succeed, we have to be at the cutting edge. But Epstein reminds us that history tells a different story. Think about it. The internet itself wasn't invented all at once. It was the stitching together of protocols, cables, and languages that already existed. Same for the iPhone, a combination of touchscreens, accelerometers, and wireless tech that had all been around for years. The genius wasn't invention, it was assembly. Now, let's bring this back to your life. Have you ever dismissed one of your skills or past experiences as irrelevant? Have you ever told yourself, that job I had years ago doesn't matter now, or that hobby is just for fun, it's not useful? This chapter challenges that mindset. What if your most powerful insights aren't in your future, but buried in your past experience, just waiting to be reconnected in a new way? Maybe your background in art will make you a better software designer. Maybe your interest in psychology will transform how you manage your team. Maybe your old job in customer service will help you build a company people love. But here's the trick. You can't make those connections if you're too focused. If your head is down, grinding in one direction, you miss the sideways opportunities. Lateral thinkers lift their heads. They roam. They remix. Epstein points out that Nobel Prize winners are far more likely than their peers to have hobbies in the arts, music, dance, painting. Why? Because these creative pursuits open up lateral pathways. They build metaphor muscles. They prime the brain to connect instead of just deepen. This doesn't mean depth is useless. It means depth and range together are where real innovation lives. Specialists dig wells. Generalists build bridges. So how can you apply this? Start with curiosity. What are some old skills or interests you've left behind? What withered technology is sitting in your metaphorical garage? A language you studied, a side project you started but never finished. an outdated tool you used to love. Next, experiment. Try putting two things together that do belong. Read outside your field. Work on a project that feels weird. Surround yourself with people who think differently than you do. And finally, don't underestimate play. Gunpei Yokai's brilliance didn't come from grinding. It came from tinkering, from taking things apart, trying new combinations, exploring for the fun of it. That's the essence of lateral thinking. It's serious play. Here, what this chapter leaves you with: you don't need the newest, flashiest tools to make an impact. Sometimes, you just need to look sideways. And if you feel like your skills are scattered, your experience too eclectic, your interests too varied, good, you're building a toolbox full of strange, beautiful parts. The magic happens when you start putting them together. Chapter 10: Fooled by Expertise. Let's begin with a question. Who do you trust when the future is uncertain? Do you turn to the man with the microphone and the Harvard degree? The woman who's written 3 bestsellers and seems to have a model for everything? The analyst with decades of experience and complex spreadsheets? That instinct to trust experts is deeply human, and often it makes sense. In well-ordered, predictable environments, think chess, mathematics, or engine repair, experience really does make someone better. Practice, pattern recognition, feedback, it all adds up. But here's the catch. Most of life doesn't work like that. In messy, unpredictable, complex environments, the very kind most of us live and work in, experience doesn't always lead to better judgment. In fact, sometimes it leads to worse. David Epstein introduces us here to Philip Tetlock, a psychologist who conducted one of the most sweeping and rigorous studies of human judgment ever attempted. Over 2 decades, Tetlock gathered over 28,000 predictions from nearly 300 experts about political and economic trends. These were serious professionals, journalists, intelligence analysts, academics. The results: the experts performed barely better than random chance. And worse, the more famous and confident the expert, the less accurate their predictions. Let that sink in for a moment. These are the people we put on talk shows, ones we ask to forecast elections, stock markets, wars. And when tested over time, their track records crumble under scrutiny. Why? Because they suffered from what Tetlock calls the illusion of knowledge. These experts weren't dumb. Far from it. But their knowledge made them overconfident. They built beautiful models, internally consistent, well-articulated theories that felt right. But they forgot a crucial truth. In complex systems, small unknowns can spiral into massive unpredictability. Think weather, economies, pandemics, geopolitics. Epstein draws a striking contrast between 2 kinds of thinkers: the hedgehogs and the foxes, a metaphor originally from the ancient Greek poet Archilochus. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Hedgehogs are specialists. They have a single framework and apply it everywhere. They look for clarity, order, and certainty. Think pundits who always blame one cause, or investors who cling to a single strategy. Foxes, on the other hand, are generalists. They gather ideas from multiple domains. They're cautious, flexible, and open to being wrong. They adjust their predictions as new data comes in. They think in terms of probabilities, not certainties. Tetlock's data was clear. Foxes were far more accurate. They were better forecasters because they embraced complexity, and they weren't married to one story. They used range. This doesn't mean we should ignore expertise altogether. Epstein is careful here. He's not saying that all experts are clueless. In many domains like surgery or air traffic control, expertise is invaluable. But he warns us, don't mistake confidence for competence. In fact, one of the most dangerous combinations is high confidence paired with low accuracy. And that's exactly what overspecialization can create in a complex world. So, what can we do with this insight? First, question dogma. If someone insists they have the answer to a complex problem, be skeptical. Ask, what assumptions are they making? What are they not considering? Are they open to being wrong? Second, adopt the mindset of a fox. This doesn't mean being indecisive. It means staying intellectually agile. Seek out conflicting views. Mix sources. Be willing to revise your beliefs. Favor humility over certainty. Third, diversify your thinking diet. Read beyond your field. Engage with people who disagree with you. The broader your mental models, the less likely you are to be trapped by one faulty lens. And perhaps most importantly, normalize saying, I don't know. That phrase is not a weakness, it's a strength. It's a sign that you're resisting the illusion of certainty and instead choosing to engage with reality as it is, complex, uncertain, and in constant flux. This chapter feels especially urgent today, doesn't it? We live in a world drowning in confident predictions. Politicians promising outcomes. Financial gurus guaranteeing returns. Tech evangelists forecasting revolutions. But beneath the polished presentations, the world remains stubbornly unpredictable. What Epstein is really teaching us here is epistemic humility, the ability to know what we don't know, and to stay flexible in the face of that mystery. It's not sexy. It won't win you airtime on cable news. But in the long run, it's far more reliable. And here, where it comes back to you. Whether you're a leader, an entrepreneur, a student, or just someone trying to make better decisions, your power lies not in certainty, but in curiosity. So next time you're in a room full of confident voices, remember, the ones who ask better questions, not the ones with louder answers, are often the ones we should be listening to. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon.